Good morning. Today, we've got to cover a little bit of historical ground before we jump into what we discussed last week a little bit, was that we're going to talk about Reconstruction. And so, really briefly, give me some ideas or thoughts on why we had a civil war. What was the cause of the Civil War?
No one wanted, someone had an opinion and the other didn't like that opinion.
That's a good way of saying it. Yeah, one person had an opinion, or one side had an opinion.
Yeah, I guess the most basic way of saying it is two people disagreed on ways of living,
Mm-hmm.
and they were trying to fight for which side of rulership would end up.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? So, as we've been discussing, really the goal of ultimately understanding the Constitution is an understanding of how culture is built and culture is shaped. Now, obviously, in the context of American culture, we came to a pretty significant issue when the Civil War broke out. It's probably the greatest difficulty our country's ever faced. And so there's many reasons behind ultimately what led to the Civil War, and we've kind of addressed it. I think the heart of it is disagreements in opinions and thoughts. And so last week we shared really the goal of understanding our rights is that we need to understand our rights in the context of how we as individuals hold those rights. We hold those rights with an understanding that we, the people, right, and each of us as individuals of the group of people, in order to form a more perfect union, need to limit our own rights. And so properly understood, our rights are not for the sake of demanding that we can have whatever it is that we want, but that we limit our rights, even though we have, and the best example of this is the First Amendment, even though we have the freedom to speak and to say what we want, is that always conducive to an environment in which we want to bring unity? Right? If in any family you got to say whatever you felt, whenever you felt it, would that lead to positive outcomes? Probably not. Right? And we all can understand, too, from the perspective of we've all had difficulties, challenges in relationships with other people. We've not liked people. People have not liked us for whatever reasons. And those reasons can be vast and they can be many. But ultimately, when we look at the Constitution, the beauty of the Constitution as it is framed out is that things can be added. And so when there's the majority, right, 75% of the vote, we can make new amendments and rally around those amendments. And so the Civil War was really key for a lot of reasons historically for our country. But in particular, as we're addressing these next few articles, and why they were added, we need to understand historical context of the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is primarily thought of in modern times to be fought over slavery, and that certainly was a component to it. It wasn't necessarily the major component to it, but it certainly played a major role. And so slavery at that time had been largely sectioned off. And so you had the states in the South, which were pro-slavery. The states in the North, generally speaking, were anti-slavery or abolitionists who believed that the original intent of the Bill of Rights and ultimately the Declaration of Independence was for all men to be free, all men to be created with certain rights. And the southern states didn't necessarily see it as how we see it sometimes painted as simply just being those people are lesser. But there was a great deal of economic issues that had to surround that. In fact, we know from history that some of the main generals, including Robert E. Lee, was actually anti-slavery, but he fought for the South because he believed that the South's way of life was being infringed upon. And so we see the invention of the cotton gin, and cotton as a whole was like the major commodity at that time. And so you think of like oil nowadays, like oil prices, and you've seen gas prices, how they've shot up. Like gas is expensive, but like back then, cotton was like the thing, and the southern states were just perfect for it. And so it wasn't as simple as, and this is obviously no justification, for slavery wasn't as simple as we think these people are lesser than us and so we're going to put them into service to us. It was also having to do with, we've got all of this fields, and we need a labor force. And so that was one of the strains that began to put on in the country, because you would again see abolitionists who saw this as a really clearly defining thing for America, that either we all have rights or none of us have rights. And others who it was much more nuanced. So you certainly had the blatant racists who thought that anybody who wasn't of their particular skin color, ethnicity, racial background was less than. And so you certainly had that. But then you had a wide majority of things that were faced by socioeconomic issues. And so it was a simple matter of fact of like, who are we going to get to work? And ultimately back then, the thought was, right, we can hold these people in indentured servitude because we don't have to pay them, right? Versus having it where we hire people in. Nobody wants to work. Cotton fields were famously difficult to work with. And so we see that not only is it now an economic thing, and there's some social kind of issues hovering around this, we also saw that in the Supreme Court, probably the most significant error the Supreme Court ever made was in the Dred Scott case. And so Dred Scott was a former slave who was owned originally, I believe, in the North, and then moved throughout the South, and all of that. The husband, the primary owner of the slave, so Dred Scott, his wife and kids, passed away. The wife then took over control. Dred Scott tried to buy his freedom from the wife, and she said no. So he took the wife to court and demanded to have his rights. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court decided 7-2 against Dred Scott and said, the reason that we're deciding this is because you are not a citizen. Under the Constitution, you can't be a citizen because you are, in fact, a Negro. And so this now led, again, to more culmination of not only it just being a simple issue of slavery or not slavery, but again, this really divisive rhetoric around who has rights and who doesn't. And so properly understood, we want to see that the Civil War is ultimately about rights. The South believed in state rights, and that was a big reason why they were pulling away and ultimately would pull away from the Union and secede from the Union, because they believed that the Constitution afforded their states as rights to even disband from the Union. Another major component, and likely could have been one of the most major components, was that the President of the United States was Abraham Lincoln. And he was not very well liked. And I'm going to just read a short speech here. And he's addressing this as far as the whole idea of slavery in states. And so as we're expanding towards the West under what James Polk, President of the United States, called our manifest destiny. So he believed that we were gifted by God with a manifest destiny to take over all of the Americas, that it was the right of America given to them by God to create more states, to have a greater union. And so we began to expand west, and this question came up, like how are we going to decide whether states are free of slaves or whether states allow slavery? And so we came up with the Missouri Compromise. And so the northern states along that parallel line would be free of slavery. The southern states would include slavery. And then we had something that's called Bleeding Kansas. And so Bleeding Kansas was decided basically of like, well, we're not going to just divide things along some imaginary line of whether states can determine whether they have slavery or not. We're going to leave it up to the states. And so again, all of this stuff is building and building, and they begin to now have this kind of cemented idea around the fact that we need to address this issue of who has rights. And again, from an abolitionist standpoint, those who were trying to abolish slavery, the thought was this: it was simple. Either we all do, or none of us have rights. Which means for us as individuals, either we are protecting the rights of everyone and not thinking of just what I want, Or we have to also say that no one really truly is free. Because if any of us are limited, we're all limited in that capacity. And so, speaking at a state convention, Abraham Lincoln says this: "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Now, this happens before the Civil War and demonstrates for us the insight that Abraham Lincoln had. Either we will become all one thing or we will become all other, right? And again, thinking of this in the language of culture, right? There are things in culture that have to be addressed and eradicated, unhealthy things. Or ultimately there will be a contention. You could say it's a civil war that will be striving, there will be difficulty. Abraham Lincoln rightfully saw this in the speech, actually really kind of pushed him towards the presidency. It was looked at very, very favorably. It was also a speech that made the South hate him. And so if you'll notice, though, the language in there, what Abraham Lincoln was seeking to do was to keep the Union together. The goal of it was, again, this idea of we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Now, the states from the South decide to secede, and the Civil War starts because Abraham Lincoln wants to go to war to protect the Union. And so he will wage a war, determined to wage a war for the sake of unity and not division. He will choose to wage a war rallied again around this great ideal that if we're going to fight over something, let's fight to be all this way and not the other. And like I said last week and a little bit today, we see the state of Virginia in large part enter the war not because it had any personal investment in seceding, but because Northern troops advanced into their sovereign state, and they were defending their state. And so the Civil War went on for many years, and you guys probably know the story pretty well, right? Like the Civil War was the single bloodiest war America's ever fought, probably will be. Why? Because it's Americans fighting against Americans, right? And we've heard the terminology, right? Brothers fighting brothers, and that legitimately happened. There were families like on other sides of riverbeds that fought against each other. There were literal brothers, literal families that were at war with one another. War at then still, it wasn't as civilized, if you could say that, as it is now. You still had, marching over long fields with nothing to hide behind, opening fire at one another, shooting cannon artillery at one another. And so it was brutal. In fact, you were counted as the lucky ones if you were killed instantly. Most people died because of their wounds and would linger for days and days and days. And so why do we want to have that context? Because ultimately, to properly understand the Constitution and the rights that we have to understand the depths of difficulty it took to get there. Any culture worth shaping is a culture worth fighting for. And there are things, are there not, in our lives that we have to reflect upon to say that these are things that we will fight for. And maybe we don't go to the extreme of actually taking up arms. However, it's a pretty telling thing, is it not, that Abraham Lincoln was willing to fight the bloodiest war in the history of America, that he was willing to pay that cost. Why? For the sake of our Union. That tells us a lot about what Abraham Lincoln thought of the idea of American culture as it should be, not as it was. And so we get to the Civil War. We see that the South begins to win pretty regularly. The South had by far the better generals, better tacticians, all of those things. But some crazy things started happening because in the Western theater you had this little-known general at the time. He actually wasn't really considered to be a great general. He was one of the lowest in his class at West Point, but his name was Ulysses S. Grant. He began to win these battles in the Western theater. Abraham Lincoln cycled through his ultimate generals that he had overseeing the whole army time and time again when they wouldn't win and they wouldn't win and they wouldn't win. Up until a battle in a little Pennsylvania town, actually outside of a Bible college, a seminary in Gettysburg, did the war really shift, right? And we know the Battle of Gettysburg was kind of the turning point of the Civil War, where finally the North held out against the South. And it wasn't like the battle wasn't won because the North was the aggressor. The battle was won because the North really had really great strategy, and the South could have easily won. Many of the people who were there owe it to the divine hand of God that ultimately the South didn't win. And then that was a major loss. There's a lot of reasons for it we won't get into. But then, as we read a while ago, Abraham Lincoln came and gave his Gettysburg Address, which again solidified the nation and this ideal of advancing towards union. We finally get to that point. The war is resolved in the favor of the North, and then begins this great work of reconstruction. And so like anything, when things are torn apart and relationships are damaged, there comes a time for reparation, where we need to look at how do we then go about building it, and what are we going to put in place. And so from a constitutional standpoint, there were things that they had to look upon and reflect upon and say, okay, these are things that we need to add to the Constitution here in order for this to not happen again. And we all know that then President Lincoln was assassinated, which prolonged the healing. And in fact, the nation wasn't really able to fully heal from the Civil War because of it. And we see that even issues within racial lines kind of carried on for many more years as a byproduct of that. And so the Reconstruction phase, as we're looking at it, will be Articles 13, 14, and 15. And so reflecting upon this, though, individually, how do you, what are some ways that you guys go about making amends or reconstructing relationships that have been broken down? Has anyone ever had like a fallout with a friend or someone like that where it was a pretty difficult thing and you had to go about like, how do we make this work?
I've had that happen, and I feel like a good thing that I've done is taking a break from that person for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and then once you come back, there's settlement after that point.
Yeah, so getting proper perspective, pulling away from, yeah, good. That's it. No one else has ever had a conflict. Well, maybe it wasn't just a complete, maybe it wasn't quite the level of Civil War where you're at each other's throats, but I mean, we can all identify with just difficulties. Maybe you've had difficulties with a sibling, parent, friend. How do you make amends when that happens? You're a very talkative group today.
You come together and talk
it out.
Talk things out, and another good thing to do is try your best not to consider yourself the right one, and to consider both people as not, or maybe both in the wrong, or neither right or wrong, to just not have things be one-sided.
Yeah. Proverbs 25:28 says, like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. And I think to your point, and that's kind of the heart of ultimately how do we bring about restoration or reconstruction, is we cannot come with a mindset of I was right and you were wrong. And we see even some of that language here in some of these articles, because they're going to lay out this idea of what was wrong and how we need to address it. And in fact, they're going to write into our Constitution where there are certain types of people now who are not allowed to represent our government, that are not allowed to be elected officials. And there's a reason for that. Obviously, one of the main concerns in the Reconstruction was as the northern states didn't secede, they got to vote on all of the laws. And so they didn't allow any of the southern states to vote. So that made it pretty easy, right, to vote. But one of the things that they had to do was consider, if we're bringing them back into the fold now, we don't want these people in office who were, formerly pretty dogmatic about pushing back against what we're thinking. And so we have to put some limitations on that. But again, with the understanding of our rights are given to us, not so that we can say, this is my right, but so that as individuals we can be a part of a collective group. We need to practice self-control. We need to demonstrate a heart and an attitude in which it allows people to come back to the table. And this was the great difficulty of the Reconstruction, as you can imagine. These states had spilled blood. And so it wasn't as simple as we disagree over fundamentally how we should run our country. It was literally, we have seen friends die for the sake of what we hold to be true. And so imagine from a Southerner's perspective now coming back to the table. It's a pretty bitter pill because you felt you were in the right here. And as it turns out, you didn't win that battle. And so now you're having to come back and humble yourself to resubmit to the authority of the Union and this idea of we the people. And so we see that, though, right? There's this lingering attitude that carries on after that of a lack of submission to the greater good. Why? Because you had people that were coming with the mindset again of like, we were in the right and we were justified, and this was stolen from us. This is why we see the assassination of a president. Because instead of coming to grips with the reality of what happened, it was much easier for that individual and individuals who advocated for it to simply remove Lincoln. Now imagine again that you were from the North and the temptation to feel like we won, so we get to legislate everything and we're in control now and we're in power, and having to fight against that nature, to not humble yourself and come back to the table with a little bit of like, how are we going to bring people in? And this is why the Reconstruction failed. And again, largely in part that Lincoln was assassinated, because as demanding as he was and as clear-cut as he was to decide things, he was also very good at bringing people into the fold. And so he was divisive and not intentionally split the country, because he was really clear in what he stood for, but he was also very good in rallying people together and coming to a common cause, as we see in his speeches. And so the first article we see is now Article 13. So Amendment 13, slavery and involuntary servitude. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And so how does Article 13 lead us to the concept of a more perfect union?
What does servitude mean?
Like basically forcing you to work. Yeah, so similar to slavery, although they would have defined slavery and servitude as a little bit different. And so the popular understanding of slavery would be very much for certain groups racially of people, where servitude would be more kind of forced labor. And so it wouldn't necessarily just be about the color of one's skin or the race, but it just would be about an imbalance of power. So So imagine, if you will, how many of you have a job? How many of you get paid for that job? Like, you get paid money. How many of you have to do it?
Yeah.
How many? Well, have to. Like, you're forced to do it.
Oh, well, I have to because I have to make money. But
Right.
Not forced.
Well, so that's different, right? But you make money. You get compensated for your work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, imagine a life in which there is no compensation. It's not really a choice, right? Because as a kid, your parents make you do your chores. It's not like you want to. So you could say, well, I have to do what my parents ask me. But imagine a world in which there would be extreme consequences if you refused. And so when we think of slavery in a modern sense, this is the kind of slavery that we think of, right? When you watch movies or you think about, like, whips and lynchings and all of those sorts of things, and certainly that was part of it. But we're addressing now not just this individual with one particular group, but what we know historically throughout American history was that there were many types of slaves. And so before it was African American slaves, the Irish were actually treated the worst. So my people in Boston and in New York, they would have been considered the slaves. They were considered the worst of the worst, right? Because again, you're coming from Great Britain, and they would have held themselves up as being the better, and those who came from Ireland were considered paupers and poor and disgusting and wretches. And so we see again throughout American history people who would have been treated less than, right? If you came from wealth, you were very fortunate. If you didn't come from wealth, you would be working for someone. And generally, as a rule, you would not be working for them because you chose to. You wouldn't go for an interview, wouldn't be sitting down with the taskmaster and saying, okay, well, so give me your qualifications on how you're going to come and work in my fields. It was, you were coerced into doing so. Coerced would look like physical punishment. It could look like somebody takes a family member and holds them hostage so that you will work for them. There could have been a lot of different things. And so why is that really critical? I know you guys know this one. So I know maybe it's early on a Monday morning, but why does the thought of we don't want people to be in slavery or to be forced to work, why does that lead to a more perfect union?
Because it's no way to live in a civilized country.
Right.
It's not freedom, and that's what America was supposed to be.
But why isn't it freedom? Because the why it's not freedom is important. Because if I'm rich, what does it matter to me? If I'm the one who owns slaves, what you're talking about now is you're going to affect me financially. Affect me. So we've got to look a little bit deeper, right? You're right. You're correct in what you're saying, but why is that right? Because again, the whole reason we went to a civil war was there was a great many people who thought that doesn't affect me. It's tricky. See, culture building's not super easy. Having a healthy culture requires some foresight and some thought and wisdom. And I think, again, to your point, and I'm pressing you because I want to get us to a deeper understanding here, is that ultimately we are only as free as the way we treat the least of these. Right? We see that's a biblical understanding, right? True freedom is not found, again, in my ability to have the freedoms that I feel I deserve. True freedom is found in everyone being equally represented under the law. And so why is this critical? And Abraham Lincoln, again, said it in that speech. Because either we'll be all of one thing or we'll be all of the other. There's no middle ground here. We can't truly promote freedom in America if we have limited freedoms of any person. And certainly, if we limit it to the point of we're forcing people into labor, into work, and that increasing that, not just forcing them to work, but making them have there's severe punishments if they fail to to properly submit to authority. Right? That's the idea of, again, getting back to this authoritarian way of living, right? An authoritarian ideal does not serve we, the people. And again, that's an important distinction. And you said it rightly. So you weren't wrong in what you were saying, but we've got to dig a little bit deeper here. For us to properly understand that from a personal application standpoint is really critical, because how do we live out the Constitution and its understandings of culture without reflecting upon it as the individual? I cannot simply worry about my own rights or even just the rights of my family, because I could become very singularly focused. Again, right, looking at our community, if all Justin concerns himself with is Justin and then the Lacasse family, and I don't pay any attention or any mind or any thought to any of the rest of the group at all, well, that's a pretty bad thing. But imagine, if you will, in that same scenario, there's a particular person in another family who is being treated really, really poorly, and I think, it doesn't affect me. Is that true? In our culture, if somebody was suffering, do we not all suffer on some level? If we properly apply the understanding of what it means to be in a community or in a unified body, right? The Bible talks about this, right? If one part suffers, doesn't the rest of it suffer? But how do we then understand that? As individuals, how do you understand when other people are suffering or have difficulty? Do you guys ever give thought to one another and the difficulties that each of you may have? Or do we assume maybe, well, that person's just having a bad day? Or, I mean, again, it gets back to this idea of how do we conduct ourselves as individuals representative of we, the people? Because I can assume a great deal about what's going on if I'm looking at things through my own personal lens. And so why this article is really, really critical. It goes far beyond whether or not slavery should be right or not. I think any honest person would say, any healthy person would say, it's a bad practice. But again, we have the benefit of being on this side of history. People who are wrestling with that, it wasn't cut and dry. Historically speaking, in every culture of the world before this, more or less, slavery was common practice. It's been happening through every culture ever. In fact, there's not a historical culture that you could trace back that didn't have some of that. And that doesn't necessarily say something about the culture as a whole, because again, it gets back to this idea of individual people. Right? And so at times it wasn't a cultural standard of that group of people, but it was a cultural standard of whomever they had in leadership. But who you put in leadership is a reflection upon what? We the people. And so again, this is why we get back to the idea of a representative government being so important, and why your voices as individuals are so important, and why the decisions that we make have to go deeper than just, this is what I think, this is what I feel. There has to be some reflection upon that. And so how do we interact with one another is really of great value to understanding proper culture and how we live in it. But it's got to go much deeper than just thinking about our own thoughts and feelings and applications. It requires us as individuals, right, to overcome our own challenges, our own insecurities, our own inadequacies. And it requires us to do that by dealing with other people's insecurities, inadequacies, right? Because there's nobody who is perfect. And so properly understood, again, how we come at culture is really critical. And so what this article does for us is it gives us a really clearly defined kind of check. What this article reminds us of is the worst of us from an American constitutional understanding. This article actually comes directly at the Dred Scott case. In fact, all of these will in part and parcel. to say that the Supreme Court, we're going to fix the error that the Supreme Court made. We're going to self-govern and self-regulate. And so neither slavery, which is the wide-scale practice of having slaves, nor involuntary servitude. Now this will come into play as well, because what this is pacing us towards is for people to have reasonable work accommodations. That when you guys go to work, who would have thought that you guys get paid at your job is connected to the same article that slavery was outlawed. You can thank the Civil War in large part for the fact that you get paid a wage, and that at that job there is an expectation that you are treated not as slaves, not as indentured servants that just have to do things and get no pay, but that you're treated with a measure or modicum of respect, and that when you work there is payment for it. And there's even kind of this that will come out of this idea of like work environments have to be healthy. And so again, the importance of this, why does this build us towards a more perfect union? Because you cannot have a perfect union when it has things that are done in the shadows, right? We know that saying, right? A little leaven leavens the whole lump. In order to have freedom, we need to all be fighting for freedom for every individual, or we need to understand that none of us are free. So properly understood, how that shapes a culture is you will either be the kind of person who, and consider this in American culture, that will be very focused on my rights. This is my right. And you have a bunch of individuals who are going around shouting at each other about what their rights are. You will have somebody who is, I don't know, apathetic, who kind of understands, yeah, I get how those people's rights are being infringed upon, but it doesn't really affect me a lot. My life's not any worse for it, and so that's kind of their own deal. You can have that mindset. You can be somebody who is on another extreme side, who is going to shout other people down to make sure that everyone has it. So you're willing to infringe on this group's a person's rights in order to make sure that this group has all of the rights. None of those are healthy in the long run. And so kind of again, what this leaves us with is how do I then function in a culture where I have to be an individual who cares a great deal about my own rights and seeks to protect my own rights without infringing upon the rights of those who are around me, and who also is somebody who is fighting and trying to uphold the rights of everyone. And if we're honest with ourselves, maybe we can't fix the country as a whole, but we have a responsibility, do we not, to the people who we're in relationship with, because at the heart of all culture is relationship. And so I know certainly in our group we would not have slaves or involuntary servitude. But again, I think it goes back to the question of is how do we think about those around us who are having difficulties or challenges? If you were back in those days, how many of you would have been abolitionists, get rid of slavery? How many of you would have said slavery? We want some of that. Well, I think it's easy for us to answer that. The hard reality of it would have been thinking in terms of how we would have been impacted would have made the difference. If we needed people to work, right? And so as simple as with all the businesses that are owned, right? The simple answer would have been, if I didn't want to have to work and I could have just enjoy it, it would be nice. Would it not be? I mean, in a perfect world, wouldn't it be nice to have somebody else work where you didn't ever have to work? You just got money coming in and you never had to really apply yourself. Well, for some people who like work, that's kind of a bad deal. They would like that. But man, the whole idea of not having to break your back to do things. And so again, properly understood, this concept of relationship and how do we live together in a culture is a difficult one. How we treat whomever we consider to be the least of these. And I really want to challenge you, because likely there are people in our own minds that we think, that we look at upon, maybe not as equals with us, and maybe we need to reflect upon the difficulties that they're faced with, the understanding of their behavior not being the only part of who they are. Because if we're honest with ourselves, right, can you look at times in your life, and I won't look at anyone because I don't want anyone to assume I'm looking at you. Can you think of times in your life where you've had some difficulty and people have judged you for that difficulty? And it hasn't really helped resolve things? Or you've looked at your life when you're having difficulty and people gave you a lot of opinions, not understanding really what was going on behind the scenes? See, so culture building means, and again, this article points for us, this idea of the least of these being equal to us. And for us to properly understand, how do we apply that? It means that I, as an individual, need to have a mindset that other people are not here to serve me. That the other people around me are not less than me. And whatever's going on with them affects me. I have to have that mindset. If somebody is hurting, I have to, and sometimes it's a discipline, because sometimes you just can't make the connection naturally because you're human. I have to care about what they care about, and I've got to try to seek, not my own way, but how to mend this relationship, how to encourage this person, how to build them up. Again, it's the idea of properly understanding, right? And Jesus said it this way: "You did not come to be served, but to serve." And so properly understood, how we apply the rights that we are given in the Constitution is that there are rights that are afforded to us so that we can be of service to we the people around us. We create a more perfect union, not by putting people down and exalting ourselves, but by at times lowering ourselves, which is humility, so that we might engage with others. Now, this doesn't mean, right, that we look at ourselves and call ourselves, these terrible, horrible human beings. That's kind of a cultural thing that's happening now, is this mindset of we need to tear certain groups of people down so that we can build these other groups up. And it's the wrong way of thinking, because no one is ever really truly built up by being torn apart. But where we limit ourselves as individuals is of great importance. All right, I just spoke a lot there, like 40 minutes of me speaking. So I'm going to want you guys to engage a little bit more in this as we go through the next few. All right, next article. It's ultimately the rights, guaranteed privileges, and immunities of citizenship, due process, and equal protection. So number 1, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So do you guys see some repetition of what we've already talked about before, right? Life, liberty, property, due process. So we're echoing some things. So what is this saying, though, specifically?
That everyone has the right to live equally.
Equally, yep, that's part of it. But what is everyone defined as? All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. And so if you are born in the United States, that makes you, by birth, a citizen. Which is why we have, quite honestly, sometimes people who are fleeing from other countries, that are mothers who are pregnant, sneaking into America and having their kids here. Why? So their kids are afforded with the rights that we enjoy. Again, we live in a country with many, many blessings and rights that many other countries don't. But why this was important, again, this is a slap in the face to those who decided the Dred Scott case wrongfully, because they were saying, well, number one, you don't have rights. You're not a citizen. But if he was born in the United States, that would make him what? A citizen. Does it matter here at all, the color of their skin? Does it matter the age of which a person is? No, it just simply says if you were born here, you have the right of a citizen. Right? The definition of a citizen from America is somebody who is born here. You carry citizen, unless you revoke it. Now we can do that. You can revoke your rights and have a citizen of another country. So, but you can choose to do that to yourself. But the government cannot come in and say, nope, we don't like you anymore. You're gone. Your rights are given to you simply by birth. Now, how many of you chose to be born? Anybody here? Have a conference with your parents? No. And so again, this is an important distinction, right? And it's kind of funny to think about, right? No one asked you, but you were born here. And you were born doing nothing to earn those rights. I mean, really, think about that. There's nothing that you have done to earn it. It is simply given to you. Which means that all people who are born here are born into the same playing ground, the level playing ground, as far as our rights are concerned. Now, what we do with our rights and what we do with our life and the conditions in which we're raised in certainly shape us. So there are different factors there on whether we can become successful or whatever. But by sheer luck of the lottery to be born to parents here, you enjoy those rights. Secondly, representatives shall be apportioned among several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole numbers of person in each state, excluding Indians, not taxed. So again, we're not overcoming some things in America, are we? So we still have some issues here with Native American peoples. And we're going to wage that battle not too far after this as well. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for president and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of a state, or the members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States are in any way abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion with which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such a state. And so as far as we've come, and we've addressed this whole idea of slavery, what have we failed in? Women still do not have the right to vote. Sorry, ladies. At this time, we're building the Reconstruction, but you are not yet considered the way that you ought to be. And again, this goes back to a lot of understanding of the cultures and unhealthy cultures and cultures who are not yet perfected. But again, what is the beauty of America? Because what this does for us is it paints the picture of look how far we've come, but look how far we've got to go still. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, right? Are we perfect at that point in history? No, we are far from it, but we are being perfected. And this is an important thing for us to understand. Properly understood any culture who is trying to become more healthy must understand that we've come a long way and celebrate that. But that also looking to the future and say, we've got some distance to cover here. And then what that helps us to do is reflect as an individual. What can I do? How do I relate in this culture to help us, to assist this culture to be healthier? Instead of it being, well, what is everyone else going to do for me in order to make the way easier for me? And so it also says a few things here that are important to note. Number one was that now all of a sudden counting the whole number of persons. So remember that when things were originally established for the electors, people of African descent were not considered a whole person. And so their numbers weren't counted as one individual, right? They were considered fractions. And that was for electoral college and a whole bunch of other reasons. And now what it's saying is that was an error. We're now counting them as actual citizens, whole numbers. All right? And again, we're still not reflecting on women and children. We haven't gotten that far yet. But then the last thing, which was really important, is that no one can hold office if they've participated in rebellion or other crimes. And so now we're limiting. And so what did that mean? for the southern states, people who are really invested and involved in any kind of criminal activity in the war would have not been allowed to represent the South. And so what they're doing now is we're limiting those who can come back into office, because again, the fear would be, right, that you have the same leaders that had crimes come up against them. And so if you were a general, that would be considered a crime. You really couldn't be in office now. Whether or not you believed what anyone else believed is irrelevant. We're trying to curb anyone's ability to be in office. And in fact, right now we have in Georgia, in the state of Georgia, a case that is involved with this very amendment. And it has to do with the last presidential election. You know, there were some people that went into the halls of Congress and things like that. And there were some people that made some tweets on their apps and stuff like that, and said, you know, we the people and blah blah blah. Well, there's this a politician from Georgia. She is a Republican and is what they would call a firebrand. So she just is like really like adamant about her side of things. And she had been really a big advocate for people protesting on January 6th, believing herself that the presidential election was not rightly decided and it was in fact stolen. And so she's come out and said all of this. And so primarily some of the opposing party in that area in Georgia are taking her to court over this and saying, see, she has incited a rebellion. And because she's incited a rebellion having to do with January 6th, we believe that she can't come up for re-election in November. And this is playing itself out. And so there was a couple other states where they tried to do that, and the states Supreme Court said, no, this is not, we're kicking this one down. This is not even a legitimate argument. Georgia, for whatever reason, they're trying this case, and they're currently legislating some of that. And so we'll see that play out, where now in a modern society, we're seeing some of these laws that were written, that maybe even the way that you tweet or your social media platform, the way that you say things could disqualify you. Again, that can be a pretty fearful thing, can it not? If we limit people on the worst things that they've said, not necessarily that they've done, but things that they've said. All right. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or any other state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. So again, this is what they're saying by the way she tweeted and the way she's called for people to rise up. What they were saying is this is akin to insurrection and rebellion. She's encouraging people to do this. Or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such a disability. And so even in this, though, what we've done is we've kind of put in a provision to say, okay, now listen, we understand that there might be some people that did some bad things in their past. And so we're going to leave it open to a 2/3 vote, because we believe that people can rehabilitate. Again, the whole idea of reconstruction being one where people are given an opportunity to change. So, kind of the one out would be if a person demonstrates kind of what they did was wrong and they've really truly changed, a majority rule here, 2/3 vote, will indicate that yes, we'll give them the ability to run for office. The validity of public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services in suppressing insurrection or rebellions, shall not be questioned. But neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in the aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss of emancipation of any slave. But all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void. And so basically what this does is it addresses the monetary benefit for holding slaves and saying there's no debt that's being paid. Your slaves are free. You don't get compensated for it. You decided to do that. They're free now. You lose money. Number 5 there, the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Again, using this language, by appropriate legislation, because what they're foreseeing is what could happen, inappropriate legislation. And so this has to be then determined in the courts. What is appropriate legislation? What isn't appropriate legislation? So, for example, could a state go back and say, we're going to have slaves again? Would that be appropriate legislation? No. Could they say, we're going to allow criminals to have to work for free? Would that be appropriate legislation? Well, looking back at Article 13, it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. And so in certain lights, that would be appropriate, right? In the context of what we're talking about. So certain groups of people, if they've done this, could then be held accountable. And again, this is important for us to understand in the modern culture. Again, we have this idea that people aren't individuals, and that the faults that we have within certain communities is because there's this historical abuse of those communities. When in fact, what we're saying is no, we need to have laws that criminalize individuals and not groups of people. All right, last article, rights of citizens to vote. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So not only have we abolished slavery, but we've given every male the right to vote. Which again, we went from slavery to now every man can vote within a very limited amount of time. And again, what this teaches us, understanding as we look down to Amendment 19, the women's suffrage rights, which won't happen for a few years, our country has come a long way, but it has not been perfected. And even with these articles that were passed, it would be close to 100 years before the true freedoms of marginalized communities would be realized. And so again, why is this important for us to reflect upon? Because as individuals, what Articles 13, 14, and 15 teach us is that, again, how do we go about building a culture if our mindset is simply what we think and what we feel and what we believe to be right for us, and we don't reflect upon those who are around us who are marginalized, those around us who have been abused or suffered? If we don't consider them, then we are, as Abraham Lincoln said, we are either all of one or all of the other. We are not fully whole. And so the idea here, and what Abraham Lincoln's life brought for us as far as his presidency is concerned, is the idea that we as a nation can be broken and yet healing. And that we can continue to be broken in part, but constantly healing. And that what we should do is reflect upon the wounds that we have as a people, and that we seek to find remedy in those wounds. It will be these articles that really kind of, for the first time in our culture, right? Because the other articles, by and large, were founded years and years before. What these articles have done for us now is say, we can choose a different outcome. We can change the course of our destiny if we are willing to fight for what we believe and deem to be right and good and whole. And so we will see then, following this up, as we get into Amendment 16, income tax, election of senators. We go into this time of prohibition where you can't drink intoxicating liquor. Then we have this great idea of women's suffrage and women get the right to vote. We talk about terms of the president, vice president, members of Congress. We get into then the repeal of the 18th Amendment, where we see for the first time in our history that amendment is passed and then another amendment makes it null and void. And so we, even in our own country, and we'll talk about this a little bit next week, have this kind of design where we can reflect upon mistakes that we've made and cast those mistakes out again. And then we see the presidential tenure, Amendment 22, Amendment 23, presidential electors for the District of Columbia, Amendment 24, abolition of the poll tax qualification, Amendment 25, presidential vacancy, disability, and inability, Amendment 26, reduction of voting age qualification, which was a pretty significant one. And then lastly, 27, congressional pay limitation. And then we see this great silence where we've had it as a country, where we have not really passed any super productive amendments. And the reason for that is similarly to where we have headed as a nation getting into the Civil War, we have increasingly become a people who are much more concerned about our individual rights than how our individual rights should be reflected in the way that we operate in a community of we the people in order to form a more perfect union. And so this week, I want you to reflect upon practical application, right? This week, I want you to reflect upon how do you consider others? How do you consider them in the context of relationship? And it's more of an introspective thing. Do you find that you hold others less than you should hold them? And if you do, okay, understandable. Chances are you likely do. How do you then go about in your own heart and your own mind consider for the greater good of the community that you live in, right? Because what we see through slavery is that what happens to the least of these in our understanding is telling of who we are as a people. So how do we reconcile and deal with that? And so you don't have to, next week when we share, you don't have to like open up and, well, I thought so-and-so was, but just reflect upon that. Because again, at the heart of what we're talking about here is culture building and relationship. And how do we become a people who are being perfected and not simply people who feel like we have arrived and we have no more need to go further. All right, that is it. Reminder that the 11th, I think we've set a little bit over a week. We have our essays that are due to be turned in. And that 2 weeks from today, we will begin giving our oral presentations on We the People or A More Perfect Union.